If you're watching this video, then you've already watched the first question, the evidence video, which includes one model of how this strategy works. This video is just a couple of extra models. So let's remind ourselves what we use the strategy for. We use it to stress test a claim that we've read in a source. We use it to stress test our own theories as we're coming up with them, or an argument that we're constructing. And we can also use it to consider whether we need to include a counter-argument in our writing. In order to use this strategy, we put ourselves in the position of a skeptical reader. We ask three questions. Is there any evidence which could disprove this claim? Are there cases or situations that the evidence does not explain? And could there be a different interpretation or explanation of the evidence? Based on the answers to those questions, we could decide the claim is valid, decide that it's only valid in some situations, decide that it's generally true, but there's some weak kind of evidence against it or some minor exceptions, or decide that it actually needs to be modified so that it explains more of the evidence. If we're constructing an argument and we end up with a claim that's only valid in some situations, or one which has some evidence against it, albeit weak evidence, then especially if we have a potentially skeptical audience, we may want to consider including a counter-argument. So let's look at how we might go through this process and then decide on the counter-argument. Model 2, the claim is organic agriculture results in more nitrogen leaching than conventional agriculture. Our evidence is that even though organic farms have less nitrogen leaching per unit of area, per unit of product, it's 49% higher than conventional farms. Now, a skeptical reader might think, but I think I've heard of organic farms that don't use fertilizer at all, not even manure. So if we think about the question, are there cases or situations that the evidence does not explain? We do our research and we discover that if an organic farm uses cover crops to add nitrogen to the soil rather than manure, then the nitrogen leaching is negligible. So the result of our questioning here is that the claim is true, but it's not true in all situations. It's not true in the situations where they use cover crops. So because of that, we are going to include a counter-argument. We decide when we write our argument, and the turn against for that counter-argument might be, one might object here that not all organic farms apply manure as fertilizer, and we continue with our explanation of how cover crops are a different case. Model 3 is actually from Scientific American. If you're interested in it, you can look up the June 2018 issue. The claim is that climate change is causing animals to become smaller. The evidence is that a number of species have recently been documented as having shrunk. And further evidence is that we can explain this using a study where from 169 species, 90% of the species were found to shrink when the temperatures were higher, or they were found to mature at smaller sizes, so over time they shrink. And there's a possible cause between the increased metabolic rate at higher temperatures. If we ask ourselves the question, could there be a different interpretation or explanation of that evidence? And Scientific American says there possibly is one. It's possible that humans are catching and eating the larger animals, thus removing genes for larger body size from the population. So there's weak evidence against our claim, and so because of this, if we've got a skeptical audience, we're going to include a counter-argument. The counter-argument could be this. The turn against in the counter-argument could be this. So there is, however, at least one competing explanation for some shrinking animals, and that is simply that humans are catching and eating the bigger ones, and we go on with our evidence. So if you're constructing counter-arguments and you've used this strategy to come up with the turn against, you may want to look at how you construct the next part of the counter-argument, the turn back, using the strategy refute or relativize.